A shadow falls over Widow's Lane, and one secret refuses to stay buried. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your words make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's uncover the truth. The annual Flaxborough Flower and Produce Show began, as it always did, with rain. It was a light, insinuating drizzle that seemed less interested in falling than in simply existing around people, hanging in the air, gently dampening enthusiasm. Under the striped awning of the horticultural tent, the competing entries sat in dignified defiance of the weather. Chrysanthemums in militant symmetry, onions polished to the gloss of billiard balls, and a marrow so large that several local schoolboys were suspected of having rolled it here from the allotments under cover of darkness. Mrs. Arabella Vinicum, chairwoman of the Women's Rural Advancement Circle and three-time winner of the decorative basket category, was making her final circuit of the tables. Her shoes squelched softly on the temporary boards. "I must say," she declared to anyone within conversational distance, "it's quite unthinkable that the council should allow exhibitors to handle each other's entries without gloves. One can never be too careful about soil-borne infections." "Indeed," murmured Mr. Riddle, who managed the local hardware shop and rarely contradicted anyone whose husband had once served as mayor. It was at this moment that the hum of genteel judgment was broken by a strangled cry from the next row. A small knot of people turned to see Mrs. Pratt, the vicar's wife, standing before a table of potted fuchsias, her hand clasped over her mouth. "Good heavens," she gasped. Oh, how dreadful." The cause of her distress appeared, at first glance, to be a toppled pot and a few scattered petals. But as the crowd thickened, whispers began to circulate with astonishing rapidity. "Something in the soil," one woman hissed. "A hand, they say." Inspector Purbright, when he was later informed of the matter by Constable Love, received the news with the same calm interest he might have shown toward an unusual cloud formation. "A hand, you say?" "Yes, sir. Found in the flower tent. Wrapped up in string like a joint from the butcher's, sir." Purbright looked out of his office window. The drizzle continued, patient and impartial. "I suppose," he said, "we'd better go and see whether it's pointing toward anything useful." By the time Purbright arrived at the showground, the excitement had already reached what might be called the post-moral stage, the point at which the townspeople felt justified in being thrilled by something that ought, technically, to appall them. The tent was surrounded by damp spectators and officious volunteers attempting to preserve the scene. Mrs. Vinicum, to whom authority came as naturally as perfume, was directing traffic with a rolled-up catalogue. "I warned them, Inspector," she declared. "I said this would happen if standards were allowed to slip." "What standards were those, madam?" "Cleanliness, of course. Hygiene. This tent is a disgrace to civic horticulture." Purbright nodded, as though such lapses could easily result in a severed hand among the begonias. Constable Love, red-faced with importance, pointed to the fuchsia table. "Here, sir. Found just under the edge. The judges hadn't even begun on this section." The object lay on a square of brown paper. It was, mercifully, not a human hand at all, but a plaster cast, crudely molded, its fingers curled in a stiff parody of life. Across the back, in faded green paint, ran the words, "Mrs. E. Cattermole, 1932. Purbright bent to examine it. "A relic of some kind," he murmured. "Or a souvenir." From the murmurs of the crowd came the name again. Mrs. Cattermole, spoken with an air of both recognition and unease. She had died, everyone remembered, many years ago, and quite alone in that house at the end of Widow's Lane. "Strange place to find her hand," observed Purbright mildly, "especially after all this time." And as he straightened, the drizzle began to turn to rain in earnest, pattering on the tent canvas like applause for a performance whose meaning no one yet understood. Rain settled into a steady pour. Purbright let the tent rid itself of the unhelpful, while Constable Love guarded the brown paper as though the plaster hand might wave. "Take it to the station," Purbright said, "and label it properly." Outside, the show persisted. The band attempted Jerusalem. The tea tent steamed. The story already had versions. Mrs. Pratt said she had seen veins. Mr. Riddle swore there was a wedding ring. A small holder claimed the fingers twitched, then admitted they might have settled. Flaxborough carried news in brisk hops. Widow's Lane, rarely named for years, became conversational fashion. The late Mrs. Cattermole, Edith or Elsie, returned as remembered benefactor, suspected hoarder, and witch who knew about herbs, which in retelling meant anything alarming. At Peebles' Barber's, Mr. Peeble declared Mrs. Cattermole a hand model. Insurers, he said, demanded casts. His customer, a bank clerk, said his aunt believed the widow kept things in jars. In the snug of the Queen's Arms, 2 councillors concluded the hand was a prank aimed at the show committee for introducing entry fees that baffled pensioners. A bus driver suspected students. By mid-afternoon, the Flaxborough and District Mercury issued a stop press, unusual object found at show. Mr. Mortlake distributed copies with gravity. He met Miss Nora Shuttleworth, who taught piano. The widow, she breathed, was seen after 11 carrying a parcel as long as a loaf. Accuracy, like talent, was something she arranged to suit the ear. Back at the station, the hand rested on Purbright's desk. Sergeant Malley, conscientious to the point of gloom, produced a file. Cattermole, Edith. Possibly Elsie. 9. Widow's Lane. Widowed young. No children. Died February 12th, 1943. Cause of death? Heart. No quarrels with neighbours? No convenient poisonings? Malley shook his head. Only a cutting. It reported a storm that flooded Mrs. Cattermole's cellar and sent water in torrents down the lane. She spent the night with a neighbour while the constable and 2 gentlemen bailed. The neighbour, Malley added, was Mrs. Arabella Vinicombe, then the councillor's wife. Purbright read the cutting twice and imagined the lane a temporary river. He thought of the plaster hand with its painted legend and of rain finding old paths. Evening drew curtains and encouraged conversation. A scout vowed an expedition to Widow's Lane and was defeated by custard. At the bus stop, a woman confided to a stranger that the hand was judgment upon the show because certain people had exhibited rhubarb they had not grown. Passing the turning home, Purbright took Widow's Lane. Daylight would not improve an empty cottage. Number 9 kept its counsel. The gate, rusted ajar, leaned like a hat after rain. Behind lay a collapsed water butt and a run of bricks that once intended a herb bed. The kitchen window's boards allowed persuasion. Inside, the room held its skeleton. Sink, slab, iron range. Purbright's torch found a tide mark above knee-height and, in a corner, fresh creeping damp. He stood listening to the house's patient noises and thought of the cast hand. A joke? A doorstop? Or something saved and labelled, then misplaced during a hurried night when water took charge? Flaxborough liked relics to explain themselves slowly. Returning along the lane, he met Mr. Mortlake's bicycle, its lamp bobbing. "Inspector," Mortlake called. "Word is the hand has a twin. Old Peeble keeps plaster odds and ends in his back room. A gentleman who had a haircut in '58 remembers one." "Barbers have many heads," Purbright said. "If they extend to hands, the talk will never end." "Thank you. The lane fancies itself a canal tonight. Go carefully." Mortlake pedalled away, pleased to have fed the town another tributary. Purbright walked on, reflecting that rumours, left alone, ran toward truth as water did. It was the banks, people, that looped them into comfortable bends. At home, he telephoned Mrs. Vinicum. She answered with poise that suggested a hat even when none was worn. "Inspector, I'm soaked to the principles," she said. "If this concerns the lamentable episode at the show, I must protest against pranks." "Only a small historical query. You sheltered Mrs. Cattermole the night her cellar flooded." A pause suggested brisk sorting of memory. "Yes, she arrived dripping, with a parcel, under her arm tied up with string. She would not part with it. She sat up on my chaise with the parcel on her knees like a cat. In the morning she went back, thanked me with a jar of something unidentifiable, and that was that." "Do you remember the parcel?" "I remember that it leaked a little. Clean water. I placed a towel underneath." When he replaced the receiver, Purbright stood still. The town had given him something almost useful, a parcel that leaked water and was held all night, as if what it contained might float away. Morning arrived in Flaxborough, as though it had not quite decided to. The clouds still leaned low over the rooftops, and the puddles of the previous night's rain reflected more grey than sky. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with a tepid cup of tea, reread his notes on the plaster hand and Mrs. Vinicum's recollections. He had, he thought, known many parcels tied with string, but very few that leaked pure water and demanded to be kept company all night. Constable Love appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, damp at the edges. "Sir, I've been up Widow's Lane, the old Cattermole place. Someone's been about there again. Boot prints, small ones, like a woman's, but newer than yours." "Ah," said Purbright, stirring his tea with deliberate slowness. "The dead do draw visitors. Did they take anything?" "Hard to say. The door wasn't forced, just pushed open, same as before. But there's marks on the kitchen table. Look like someone rested something damp there, like a flower pot or a bucket." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. "A bucket," he repeated. "And what would a lady be fetching water from Widow's Lane for, I wonder?" He rose, took his coat, and gestured for Love to follow. The air outside smelled faintly of coal smoke and chrysanthemums left too long in vases. When they reached the lane, the cottages hunched beneath their dripping eaves, and the Cattermole house looked, as ever, both forgotten and faintly disapproving of being so. Inside, the floor had been marked by shoes that did not belong to the police. Purbright examined the table. Yes, the round trace of a wet container, recently lifted. On the sill, among the dust and spider webs, lay a small scrap of paper softened by moisture. Purbright teased it up with his pencil. "Mrs. Vinicum, delivery on account, Widow's Lane Allotment Association," he read aloud. "Remarkable. It seems someone is maintaining a commercial relationship with the deceased." Love frowned. "Sir, do you think Mrs. Vinicum's been sneaking out here herself?" "I rarely think anyone sneaks, Love," Purbright said gently. "In Flaxborough they appear to sneak, which is quite another matter. Still, we shall pay her a call." At her house, Mrs. Vinicum received them with her usual blend of indignation and tea service. She wore a protective apron as though under siege from crumbs. "Inspector, if this is about that ridiculous plaster monstrosity, I assure you I've told you all I can." The woman was odd, yes, but no odder than those who keep canaries or paint stones. "Indeed. And you never had occasion to revisit her house after her death?" "Good heavens, no. Why should I?" Purbright placed the damp slip of paper on the tablecloth. "Because perhaps you've continued to use her allotment." Her expression hardened slightly before smoothing again into social correctness. "Oh, that. Well, yes. I did tend her little plot for a few seasons after she passed, purely to prevent weeds. But it's been years. Yet this note suggests a delivery quite recently. Compost, perhaps?" Mrs. Vinicum's gaze shifted to the window, where rain silvered the glass. "I've no recollection of ordering anything, though," she added with theatrical innocence, I did ask the youth at the nursery to bring me a few sacks of soil. He may have used the old address by mistake." Purbright smiled mildly. "How thoughtful of him. And you've noticed nothing missing from your garden? No barrels, no flower pots?" "None that I recall. When they left, Love said, 'She's hiding something, sir.'" "Yes," Purbright agreed, "but possibly from herself. The best lies in Flaxborough are told for the liar's own comfort." They walked through the market square, where the stall-holders discussed the mystery hand as if it were a prize-winning turnip. An old man selling newspapers muttered, "Mark my words, Inspector, they'll find the rest of her buried under the bandstand." At the corner, Miss Shuttleworth, the piano teacher, intercepted them with breathless urgency. "Inspector, I thought you should know. Last night I heard someone dragging something heavy down Widow's Lane. It was past midnight. I live just above the haberdashery, and the sound carried like stone on stone." Purbright thanked her with calm politeness. "Stone on stone, you say? Most unusual freight at that hour." Back at the station, the plaster hand awaited them under a bell jar, an exhibit already acquiring a local legend. Purbright regarded it. "Love, see if you can find who's been delivering to that allotment lately, and have a word with the lads at the nursery about recent orders under Mrs. Vinicum's name." By evening, Love returned with a receipt book smelling faintly of compost. "Got it, sir. 2 days before the flower show, a Mrs. Vinicum, same address, ordered garden lime, 3 sacks, paid cash. The delivery boy said she insisted on unloading it herself at the top of Widow's Lane." Purbright leaned back, his expression one of mild fascination. 3 sacks of lime, enough to sweeten an acre or bury a secret. I wonder which she had in mind. He walked to the window. The rain had stopped at last, leaving the street slick and bright under the lamps. Somewhere down that quiet road, he thought, a parcel once leaking water had been kept through the night. And now, decades later, the earth was being sweetened again, as if the ground were asked to forget what it had once held. The next morning arrived crisp and thin, the kind of day that made even the pigeons sound industrious. Inspector Purbright, punctual as a clock wound by someone cautious about overdoing it, arrived at the station to find Constable Love hunched over a cup of tea and a newspaper, the latter announcing in large, confident letters, "Hand mystery deepens. Police baffled." Purbright lifted an eyebrow. "Baffled, are we?" Love coughed into his tea. "I never told them that, sir. They just inferred. They're quite right, too. It adds vigor to an otherwise sluggish edition." Purbright hung up his coat, turned down the gas fire, and regarded his sergeant. "And has our bafflement progressed overnight?" Love shuffled his notes. "Bit of luck, sir. I went back to that nursery early. The delivery boy's mam says he didn't sleep proper that night after taking the lime to Widow's Lane. Said he saw someone up there after he left. Woman-shaped, but not Mrs. Vinicum. Thought it was one of them allotment ladies, you know, the kind with hats like lampshades." "An apparition among vegetables," murmured Purbright. "That should please the Mercury." Love grinned uncertainly. "She said the woman had a torch and was bent over the ground digging or something. But by the time he got back with the van, she'd gone." Purbright stood still for a moment, gazing out of the window. Digging, in the rain, at Widow's Lane, an admirable devotion to horticulture. By mid-morning they were once more at the lane. The sky hung close, pewter and dull, the air damp with the memory of rain. The path, still soft underfoot, showed faint disturbances, marks of tools, perhaps, or the hesitant pattern of someone searching rather than planting. Love knelt by the fence. "Look here, sir. See this? Soil's lighter, bit of white in it." He scraped a finger through the patch and grimaced. "Lime, just like the nursery stuff." "Applied recently," said Purbright, and without much subtlety. He glanced toward the Catamole cottage, silent under its veil of ivy. "Fetch a spade from the car, Love." Let's see what enthusiasm has been concealed beneath good horticultural practice. They worked carefully, though the ground was soft enough to yield easily. A few inches down, the blade struck something solid but not metallic. Purbright crouched, brushed aside the earth, and uncovered the edge of another plaster cast. It was smaller than the first and seemed to represent part of an arm, broken at the elbow. "Well," he said quietly, "it appears the widow's been reconstructed, one limb at a time." Love swallowed. "You think someone's making these now, sir? Or uncovering 'em?" "Both possibilities suggest an inconvenient intimacy with the past," Purbright replied. "We'll take it in for a more comfortable inspection." At the station, under the same glass dome that had sheltered the first hand, the new find looked less macabre and more pitiful. Paint flaking, the fingers stubby and crudely molded. On the underside, scratched faintly into the plaster, were the initials A.V. Purbright regarded them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It seems," he said at last, "that Mrs. Vinicum was more than a neighbor. She was, in a sense, an artist." Love's eyes widened. "You think she made 'em? Or helped make them? There's something domestic about this sort of handiwork, not the work of a prankster, but of someone who believed it worth preserving." He lit his pipe, the smoke rising in slow, thoughtful spirals. "Mrs. Vinicum spoke of a parcel that leaked, of keeping it close all night, and of Mrs. Cattermole's gratitude. What if that parcel contained not some household relic, but the beginnings of these?" Love frowned. "Bits of plaster arms in a parcel? Seems daft, sir. Perhaps. But people do peculiar things when sentiment disguises itself as duty." Purbright exhaled a soft cloud. "Let's have another word with the vicar's wife. Mrs. Pratt seems to have a well-tuned ear for impropriety." Mrs. Pratt received them with tragic interest. "I told Arabella the very morning after the show, told her it was Providence's way of making her face up to something. She said I was melodramatic, which I confess was unkind." "Did she mention Mrs. Cattermole?" Purbright asked. "Oh, yes. Always did. The woman was a recluse, but Arabella saw her as a sort of project. Charity, you know. She taught her flower arranging, and, well, there were rumors about the widow's husband. Supposedly an artist of sorts, before he ran off. Clay models, plaster saints, that kind of thing. Arabella was fascinated." "Indeed," said Purbright softly. "And what became of his work?" "Lost, I suppose, though Arabella once hinted that the widow kept a few pieces. Couldn't part with them. Imagine decorating your house with reminders of desertion." Mrs. Pratt shuddered with pleasure at the scandal of it. Outside, Love said, "So Mrs. Cattermole's husband made plaster things, and now we're digging up bits of the same. Could they be his?" "They could," Purbright said. "Or they could be hers, or Arabella's. I rather think they've all had their hands in the matter, literally and otherwise." He paused, looking toward the church spire rising primly against the low clouds. "Let's pay a visit to the allotments. If we're to find what's missing, it's likely buried under something green and respectable." The allotments stretched along the back of Widow's Lane like a patchwork quilt stitched from secrets. Rows of leeks stood in military order. Cabbages sprawled like gossipers in shawls. Near the far hedge, a patch of disturbed soil caught Purbright's attention. Someone had recently replanted the area with marigolds, bright, brave, and curiously out of season. He bent down, brushed the petals aside, and traced the faint edge of another cast beneath the soil. "Love," he murmured, "it appears we've stumbled upon a small exhibition." The constable leaned close. "Shall I fetch the spade again, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Not yet. Let the lady have her gallery a little longer. Tomorrow we'll ask her to give us a guided tour." By the time Purbright reached the police station the next morning, the marigolds of Widow's Lane had already become a talking point across half the town. The Flaxborough Mercury's headline, "Police dig in Widow's Lane, strange objects found," lay on every counter and tea table. Mrs. Vinicum's name, discreetly omitted but universally inferred, had spread like ivy over every fence. Purbright, however, appeared unruffled by celebrity. He spent the early part of the morning reading correspondence, a letter from the borough treasurer demanding reimbursement for the tent boards irreparably stained by official interference, and another from Mrs. Pratt offering moral assistance in any spiritual aspect of the case. He filed both carefully under "later." When Constable Love arrived, somewhat breathless from an errand, Purbright did not look up. "Well?" "Been to the nursery again, sir. Spoke with young Colin, the lad who delivered the lime. He swears he saw someone else that same night, carrying what looked like a rolled-up carpet. Says it might have been Mrs. Vinicum, but it was dark." "People carrying carpets in darkness are rarely innocent," murmured Purbright. "Did he say where she went?" "Down toward the allotments, sir. Said he thought it odd, too wet for gardening, but she was walking quick like she knew where she was going." Purbright leaned back, fingers steepled. "She probably did. The question is whether she was going to plant or to hide." They left together, the constable driving. The morning fog clung to the hedgerows, softening the world into secrecy. As they reached the allotments, a figure was already waiting by the gate. Mrs. Vinicum herself, in an oilskin coat and gardening hat, holding a basket of tools that looked entirely too new. "Inspector," she said, smiling with a precision that made warmth unnecessary. "I was just attending to my marigolds. You mustn't think me idle simply because I'm retired." Purbright nodded gravely. "The town would collapse without its marigolds, I'm sure. Might we have a word? Perhaps as we admire them together." She hesitated, then motioned them through. The soil was indeed disturbed, though she had attempted to disguise it with gravel. The marigolds nodded politely in the damp air. "You've been working hard," Purbright said. "I understand you had some lime delivered here." Her eyes flickered. "A gardener's staple, Inspector. Surely not an offense yet." "Not at all," he said kindly, "though it's unusual to lime soil already rich enough to grow flowers in October." Mrs. Vinicum's lips tightened. "One must prepare for spring." "Indeed," Purbright said, stooping to examine the ground. "And sometimes one must also prepare the past for forgetting." She stood very still. The only sound was the faint plop of water from a leaking barrel. Purbright straightened. "We found another plaster cast last night. An arm with initials A.V. Would those be yours, by any chance?" She gave a short, brittle laugh. "Coincidence, surely." "Perhaps. But I wonder why a coincidence should lie beneath your marigolds." Her basket tilted slightly. Inside it, among trowels and string, was something wrapped in brown paper, the shape too familiar to mistake. Purbright's gaze lingered on it. Mrs. Vinicum followed his eyes and gave a small, defeated sigh. "It isn't what you think." "I rarely know what I think until someone confirms it," said Purbright gently. "Would you prefer to tell me here, or at the station?" For a long moment she considered the marigolds as though hoping they might defend her. Then she set the basket down on the bench and unwrapped the parcel. Another plaster cast, smaller than the rest. Half a face, the nose broken away. "She made them," Mrs. Vinicum said quietly. "Edith Cattermole. All those years ago, her husband left her, ran off with a girl from the next parish. She made casts of him, bits of him, said if he wouldn't stay whole, she'd keep what she could." Love looked scandalized. "You mean those things are—" "Yes," she said, "replicas. She said she'd molded his hands while he slept. After he left, she finished the rest from memory. Obsessed, poor woman. When she died, I couldn't bear the idea of them being thrown out. I packed them away in her cellar, and when it flooded that night, I tried to save them." Purbright's expression remained calm, though his eyes had sharpened. The parcel that leaked. Yes, I kept one or two, just for sentiment. The rest were buried when the council filled the cellar, but the ground keeps giving them back. Every storm uncovers something. I only wanted to put them back where they belonged. Purbright studied her. Mrs. Vinicum, you've preserved half a century of someone else's grief. That's a heavy sort of kindness. She met his gaze, defiant now. You can't arrest me for decency, Inspector. Certainly not, he said. But the plaster pieces are now police property until we decide how best to rehouse them. I'm sure you'll understand. As they walked back toward the gate, Love whispered, So it's not murder after all, sir. Purbright smiled faintly. No, Love. Merely that most delicate of crimes, interfering with the past, and that in Flaxborough is always a hanging offence at the tea table. Behind them, Mrs. Vinicum knelt again by her marigolds, brushing soil over the disturbed earth as though tucking someone gently to sleep. Purbright had always found the aftermath of confession more revealing than confession itself. People, he believed, were never so exposed as when they thought themselves absolved. Mrs. Vinicum's tidy surrender, her calm words about decency, sentiment, and storms, had the quality of a curtain lowering just a second too soon. It was all neatly tied, perhaps too neatly. Back at the station, he spent a quiet hour looking over the casts under the glass dome. The new one, the half-face, was coarse but oddly personal. There was a shallow indentation along one cheek, perhaps accidental, perhaps deliberate. It resembled a thumbprint, pressed into the plaster while still wet. He wondered whose thumb had done it. Love, watching from his corner, said nothing for once, which Purbright took as a sign of growth. Love, he said at last, what do you make of Mrs. Vinicum? She's guilty of something, sir, the constable replied after reflection. Not a crime exactly, but guilty. Purbright smiled faintly. That's very nearly profound. Still, I'd like to know whether she's been acting alone. Obsession loves company, even if only to share the labor of digging. He sent Love to make quiet inquiries about the allotments, who came and went, who helped Mrs. Vinicum carry her sacks of lime. In a town where gossip was as natural as breathing, information rarely took long to arrive. By late afternoon, Love returned with his notebook full of the hesitant generosity of witnesses. Seems she's been seen a few times up there with a gentleman, sir. Tall, white hair, works at the museum. Name of Dr. Mortlake, runs the local history society. Purbright looked mildly amused. Ah, our self-appointed guardian of Flaxborough's dusty virtues. He once tried to have a parking meter, declared a heritage artifact. I suppose even curators need a hobby. He walked over to the window, watching the drizzle settle again like an old friend come back to gossip. We'll visit him. He may know what a respectable woman does with the fragments of a scandal. Dr. Mortlake lived in a semi-detached house that smelled of dust, pipe smoke, and disapproval. He opened the door with the look of one interrupted in mid-lecture. Inspector, I was wondering when enlightenment would call. You've been prying about our little relics, I hear. Only as part of my civic duty, Purbright said mildly. You're acquainted with Mrs. Vinicum? Mortlake ushered them in, gesturing to armchairs whose upholstery had given up decades ago. Acquainted, yes. We share an interest in preservation. She's helped me catalogue items from the old estate archives, artifacts, models, fragments of sculpture. A remarkable memory for dates, that woman. A pity she's become something of a sideshow. Purbright regarded him with polite curiosity. You knew of the plaster pieces then? Of course. She brought one to me last spring quite proudly. Said it was an example of domestic casting from the interwar period. I thought it a curiosity, nothing more, though I admit, he paused, looking faintly embarrassed. There was something about it. Too human, perhaps. I advised her to store them properly, away from damp. And did she? She said she had them all safely put away. I never imagined she meant underground. Mortlake sighed heavily, as though the town's standards had personally betrayed him. Still, I understand her sentiment. People mistake these things for morbidity, but to Mrs. Vinicum, they were history. She even spoke of donating them to the museum one day. Purbright's brows rose. All of them? Yes, though she worried one was missing. The face. She said she'd lent it once, years ago, and never got it back. Purbright tapped his pipe thoughtfully against his palm. How inconvenient, to misplace half a face. Mortlake looked uncomfortable. She hinted that someone else had borrowed it. Perhaps Mrs. Pratt. She can be meddlesome. Something about an art evening long before my time. You know how these small societies were. Papier-mâché nymphs and plaster saints, all very improving. When they left, the sky was already turning a watery amber. Love, trudging beside him, said, "You think Mrs. Pratt's mixed up in it now, sir?" "I think Mrs. Pratt is mixed up in everything," Purbright replied, "but whether intentionally or merely by the laws of gossip remains to be seen." They reached the vicarage just as the evening bell was tolling. Mrs. Pratt greeted them at the door, dressed for an occasion that didn't exist. "Inspector, do come in. I was just telling my husband that the whole business reminded me of the mysteries of the ancients. Rituals, you know. Symbolic buryings." "An apt comparison," said Purbright pleasantly. "You attended one such ritual yourself, I believe. An art evening, the kind where plaster was involved." She blinked rapidly. Good heavens, that was years ago. The Ladies' Guild sponsored it. Arabella brought some of her late friend's molds. We were to make plaques for the church hall, most of them cracked. But not all. "Well, no," she admitted, flustered. "One or two were rather lifelike. I remember Mrs. Vinicum insisting that one looked exactly like her late friend's husband. Naturally, some of us found that distasteful." Purbright inclined his head. "And what became of them?" "Oh, they were meant to be taken away. I assume Arabella did. The face was left behind for a time. Too heavy, I suppose. It sat in the church shed for weeks until someone fetched it." "Who fetched it?" Mrs. Pratt hesitated. "Now that you ask, perhaps it was the curate, or one of the vergers. I can't be sure. It disappeared anyhow." As they left, Love muttered, "So that's how it wandered off. Must have found its way back to Widow's Lane eventually." Purbright nodded absently. "Yes, things and people often do in the end." The evening air smelled faintly of coal smoke and chrysanthemums again. Purbright walked slowly toward the square, his hands behind his back, thinking of the widow who molded her husband's likeness, of the neighbor who preserved it, and of the town that unearthed it all over again. Somewhere among them was not merely sentiment, but something colder. Ownership, perhaps. Possession in its quieter form. He stopped, glancing back at the dim outline of Widow's Lane. "Love," he said softly, "I have the feeling our Mrs. Vinicum didn't dig just to hide what she'd found. She dug to see if something or someone was still missing." That night, rain returned, steady and unhurried, as if determined to revisit every place it had missed the first time. Inspector Purbright, who rarely allowed weather to deter thought, sat by his fire with a file on his knee and a cat, not his own, purring at a tactful distance on the hearth rug. The creature had wandered in from the lane weeks ago, and Purbright, being unenthusiastic about both ownership and eviction, had simply allowed it to stay. The documents on his knee were a mixture of old and new, Mrs. Cattermole's death certificate, the Mercury's latest column, suggesting witchcraft at Widow's Lane, and a brittle parish notice from 1942 regarding donations of art for the War Fund. He traced the faded print with a finger. One of the listed donors was Mr. Harold Cattermole, sculptor. Beneath it, in smaller writing, "Loan of figures, collection withdrawn, February 1943. That had been just before Mrs. Cattermole's death. He looked thoughtfully at the notice, then at the cat. Withdrawn indeed. he murmured. By whom, I wonder? In the morning the rain had thinned to mist. Purbright found Constable Love already at the station, spooning porridge with a grim dedication to duty. "Sir," he said between mouthfuls, "Mrs. Vinicum's in early. She's brought you something." That was seldom a comforting announcement. Purbright entered his office to find Mrs. Vinicum seated primly, gloved hands folded over her handbag. Her hat, black felt, raindrops glistening on the brim, looked as though it disapproved of the furniture. "Inspector," she began, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt it my moral obligation to inform you that someone has broken into my shed." "Your shed?" "Yes. I keep it by the allotments. A modest place, but orderly. This morning the door was open, the padlock missing, and, well, something had been taken. Something valuable. Sentimental, Inspector. A mould. Not of the catamoles, I assure you. Something newer. I'd begun an experiment in restoration, an attempt, if you will, to return one of the damaged pieces to its original dignity." "Ambitious," Purbright murmured. "And what precisely has gone missing?" "A plaster head," she said, a touch too swiftly. "Incomplete, of course." Purbright regarded her for a moment, then asked, "Did you show this experiment to anyone?" She hesitated. "Only Dr. Mortlake. He encouraged me, said the museum might display it one day, but surely you don't think—" "I try not to think before breakfast," Purbright said mildly. "Would you describe this missing piece?" "Life-sized, male, painted about the eyes, and broken along the neck. I covered it with cloth. It was gone this morning, and footprints, 2 sets, by the path." Purbright leaned back. "Then someone else, too, believes in your art." After she left, Love entered with his cap in hand. "Sir, shall I take a look at the shed?" "Yes," Purbright said, "and bring Mortlake in after you've done so. I suspect he'll wish to preempt our curiosity." By mid-morning, both requests were fulfilled. Love returned, muddy but satisfied. "Shed's as she said, sir. Lock forced with something heavy, and I found these." He placed a few shards of plaster on the desk, freshly broken. "Looks like whoever took it dropped part of it on the way out." "Interesting." Purbright turned one fragment over with his pencil. The plaster was clean, newly cast, not the brittle relic of the others. "So she's been at her moulds again?" Before he could add more, Dr. Mortlake appeared in the doorway, his hat damp and his expression sour. "Inspector, I assume this is about that absurd theft. Mrs. Vinicum has already called me in a state of distress." Purbright gestured toward a chair. "You seem remarkably well informed." "She telephoned me first thing. Said she feared vandals had taken her property. I told her you'd handle it, though I can't imagine anyone coveting plaster heads. Unless, of course, the head resembled someone they recognized," Purbright suggested lightly. Mortlake looked startled, then forced a thin smile. "You think she's been sculpting likenesses?" "Nonsense. Her work is purely commemorative." Purbright watched him closely. "Commemorating whom?" Mortlake's mouth twitched. "History, Inspector. Nothing more." After he'd gone, Love muttered, "He's jumpy, that one. Eyes all over the place." "Yes," said Purbright softly. "Jumpy men are rarely thieves, though they often know them." That evening, as dusk pressed low over the town, a boy delivering milk along the back of Widow's Lane noticed something pale in the ditch, a shape too deliberate to be rubbish. By the time Purbright arrived, lamps were being lit in the cottages, and a small crowd had already formed, murmuring like pigeons around crumbs. The shape proved to be the missing head, resting face up among nettles, but it was not, as Mrs. Vinicum had described, incomplete. The break along the neck had been filled, smoothed, and the features, those unmistakable, well-remembered features, were not the long-vanished Mr. Catamole at all. Purbright crouched in the lamplight, studying the strong jaw and aquiline nose. The likeness was recent, and unmistakable. It was Dr. Mortlake. Love, bending beside him, whispered, "She said it was old." "She says many things," Purbright murmured, "and some of them are even true." The constable glanced at him nervously. "Do you reckon she meant to, well, keep him, sir?" Purbright stood, brushing his hands. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she meant to remind him of a debt unpaid. Either way, love, our little mystery has just acquired a new face." He looked down once more at the plaster image, its eyes staring serenely at the drizzle, and thought, not without admiration, how thoroughly Flaxborough managed to turn even devotion into artifice. By the following morning, Flaxborough had decided that Dr. Mortlake was either dead, mad, or eloping. Each version gained detail as it moved along the high street. The librarian swore he had seen Mortlake boarding a bus with a suitcase. The butcher's wife maintained he had been carried off by those art women. And a postman, whose certainty increased with each retelling, described the discovery of a real head, not plaster at all. Purbright, reading the Mercury's latest editorial, scholar or scoundrel? Museum man in mystery, merely sighed and folded the paper beneath his saucer. At 10 o'clock, Mortlake himself telephoned, rather breathless. "Inspector, I must insist upon a meeting. Private, urgent. This nonsense must stop." His tone was that of a man forced to confront his own obituary. Purbright agreed with unhurried courtesy, suggesting the station at noon. He replaced the receiver and looked thoughtfully toward the window. "Love," he said, "if Mrs. Vinicum has not yet heard that her sculpture has acquired a portrait likeness, do ensure she does so through the usual, reliable channels." The constable blinked. "You mean through gossip, naturally. I want her to hear what everyone else will before midday. Then we shall see which of them feels the greater panic, artist or muse." When Mortlake arrived, he was pale and defensive, carrying a briefcase that looked large enough to contain several explanations. He seated himself stiffly and began at once. "Inspector, I had nothing to do with that abominable object. My reputation, my post, could be jeopardized by the very rumor of such indecency." "Then you've seen it?" "Of course I've seen it. Half the town has. Some idiot showed me a photograph. In the grocer's queue. I was appalled." Purbright regarded him with mild sympathy. "A distressing likeness, certainly. Mrs. Vinicum seems to have a gifted hand for resemblance." Mortlake flinched. "That woman is unbalanced. I told her to leave her infernal hobby alone. She must have worked from memory, or worse, from imagination. The whole thing is malicious." "Malicious," repeated Purbright quietly, "is a word one usually reserves for intent. You believe she meant to harm you?" Mortlake hesitated. She's become obsessed. Ever since we started that cataloging work, always asking about preservation, about legacy. Last month she said I reminded her of someone, her old friend's husband, I think. I brushed it off. Now, well, she's immortalized me in plaster." Purbright allowed the silence to lengthen. "Did you give her reason to think she was preserving your likeness for posterity?" Mortlake colored faintly. "I may have spoken warmly of her diligence. She's lonely, Inspector. She mistook kindness for something else. You must see that." "I do," Purbright said softly. "Loneliness is often mistaken for devotion, and flattery for affection. Both are difficult to tidy away once unpacked." Mortlake leaned forward. "I want protection from slander. If she spreads this absurd story, I'll take action." Purbright's expression remained serene. "You may not need to. Mrs. Vinicum will call here shortly. It might be clarifying if you remain for the conversation." The scholar recoiled. "I refuse to confront that woman." "Ah," Purbright said, glancing at his watch. "I'm afraid she's already on her way." Mrs. Vinicum arrived precisely 5 minutes later, upright and composed, though her gloves betrayed a faint tremor. "Inspector, I demand to know why people are saying I've sculpted Dr. Mortlake. It's a calumny. The resemblance is coincidental." "Coincidence does enjoy flattering the familiar," Purbright replied, though the detail about the spectacles frame impressed everyone. Her eyes darted toward Mortlake, who had half risen from his chair. For an instant, the atmosphere carried the brittle charge of two people seeing, with perfect clarity, the foolishness they had shared in secrecy. "It wasn't meant to mock you," she said quickly. "I only wanted to finish what was begun, the widow's work. She made likenesses of those who disappointed her. I thought I might correct that tradition, immortalize kindness instead." Mortlake's laugh was sharp and frightened. "Kindness? You've made me into a grotesque. Every child in Flaxborough will point and snigger." "You said once," she replied, her voice trembling now, "that the past only survives through what's molded. You told me I'd done what most women couldn't, preserved history with my own hands." "I meant documents, woman, not heads." Purbright cleared his throat gently, restoring order as if straightening a tablecloth after an unpleasant spill. "It seems," he said, "that both of you have pursued preservation to its natural conclusion, he through catalogues, you through casts. Between you, Flaxborough's memory is in safe, if slightly overzealous, hands." Mrs. Vinicum turned to him desperately. "Inspector, you don't believe I meant harm?" "I believe," he said, "that intention is a luxury few people can afford to examine closely. You've caused embarrassment, not injury. Still, I must ask you not to continue your creative restorations without proper supervision." Mortlake rose, clutching his briefcase like a shield. "This is intolerable. I'll have the plaster destroyed at once." Purbright smiled thinly. "I'm afraid it's already been claimed by the museum as a curiosity, a gift, one might say, to future generations. It would be ungracious to interfere now." As Mortlake departed in outraged silence, Mrs. Vinicum sank into her chair. "You think me ridiculous." "Not at all," said Purbright. "Ridiculousness, like plaster, is simply humanity set too quickly." She looked up, bewildered, as if unsure whether she'd been absolved or sentenced. When she left, the station felt oddly lighter, as though a curtain had been drawn back to let in a tolerable draught. Love appeared in the doorway. "Well, sir," Purbright smiled faintly. "The storm's over, love, though I suspect the weather in Widow's Lane may remain unsettled for some time." Outside, rain began again, thin, silvery, and persistent. Somewhere beyond the square, a lorry rattled past carrying a crate marked Flaxborough Museum. Fragile. Inside it, carefully cushioned against jostling, the plaster likeness of Dr. Mortlake stared upward, calm and enduring, as if waiting for the next pair of curious hands to decide what story it ought to tell. By the next morning, the rain had finally tired of itself and gone. The pavements of Flaxborough gleamed with that reluctant brightness particular to English towns the day after scandal. At the police station, Constable Love was sorting correspondence when a van from the museum rattled up outside. The driver handed him a brown envelope and a cautious look, as though the mere mention of the head might carry contagion. Purbright, who had been inspecting the office kettle with an air of mild disappointment, took the envelope. Inside was a typed note on the museum's headed paper. "Inspector Purbright, the plaster bust has been received. We regret to inform you that the crate was found already open on arrival. Contents missing, no sign of forced entry. Yours, R. Kynaston, Assistant Curator." He read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. "Love," he said. "It appears Flaxborough's appetite for culture exceeds its sense of security." Love looked alarmed. "You mean the thing's gone again?" "Quite. Stolen, reclaimed, or liberated. The terminology depends on who writes the next headline." The constable frowned. "Couldn't have been Mortlake. He'd never risk it, not with his name all over town." Perhaps not, Purbright said mildly. But desperation has a way of loosening moral hinges. By midday, the missing bust had achieved mythic status. The Mercury's window display bore a fresh placard. Who took the face? Beneath it, a photograph of Dr. Mortlake at a civic dinner looked unhelpfully guilty. In the Queen's Arms, patrons debated whether the head had been stolen for art, revenge, or ritual. At least one barmaid was convinced it was haunted. Purbright spent most of the afternoon listening. He had long considered gossip the town's unofficial archive. No entry was ever deleted, merely revised. By the time he returned to his office, he had assembled a curious pattern of half-truths. Reports of a figure seen near the museum after closing, a smell of damp plaster near the river bridge, and Mrs. Vinicum buying fresh lilies. Love entered with the kind of face that announced discovery, or at least entertainment. "Sir, I've found something odd at the museum yard. Crates there, but not where it was dropped off. Looks like someone dragged it toward the back gate." "Dragged?" "Yes, sir. And the ground scraped like it was pulled on its side. But no footprints, least none proper." Purbright rose, putting on his coat. "When the trail lacks feet, it's often because someone's gone to trouble to remove them. Let's see what effort buys." At the museum yard, twilight was beginning to soften the angles of the buildings. The crate lay overturned by the boundary wall, its straw padding scattered like the aftermath of an unconvincing bird's nest. Purbright knelt beside it, brushing a hand along the wood. "Someone in a hurry," he said. The nails were levered out cleanly. They knew what they wanted. Love peered into the straw. "You think Mrs. Vinicum took it back?" "It would be in character," Purbright said, "though I wonder whether pride or guilt moves her now. The one is talkative, the other discreet." He looked up toward the road. The museum's iron gate stood ajar, its padlock hanging from one hinge. Beyond it, the street curved toward the churchyard. A single gas lamp threw a faint halo over the path. "Come along, love. I'd like to call on an old acquaintance." They found Mrs. Vinicum in her drawing room, sitting upright as though carved from her own furniture. On the table beside her, a vase of lilies leaned slightly to one side, giving the impression of something faintly unsteady beneath the surface. Calm. "Inspector," she said, with that studied serenity of the recently accused, "if you've come about that dreadful business at the museum, I assure you I've heard. They'll blame me again, of course." Purbright inclined his head. "I'm sorry for the intrusion. It must be trying to see one's handiwork, or one's repute, so publicly handled." "Handled and mishandled," she replied sharply. "I had nothing to do with it." "Then you'll forgive the question," he said gently. "Do you still have the key to your shed?" Her eyes flicked toward the mantel just for a heartbeat. Purbright followed the glance and saw the faint outline of plaster dust on the carpet below. He said nothing at first. "You think I've hidden it again?" she said suddenly, her tone brittle. "That I couldn't bear the thought of them displaying it under lights, as though it were mockery." "Did you?" She looked down, smoothing her gloves, though she hadn't worn them. "I went to the museum last night, yes, to make sure it was safely arrived. The gate was open, the crate already on the ground. I only wanted to see it once more, before they made a spectacle of it. But it was gone. Someone had taken it before me." Love shifted uneasily. "Then who, ma'am?" "That," she said, voice lowering, "is what frightens me. Because I believe it wasn't taken at all. It walked." Purbright said nothing, though Love emitted a small strangled cough of disbelief. Mrs. Vinicum continued, eyes unfocused now. "When I made the head, Inspector, I felt guided, as though the mold remembered the hands that shaped it before. The same air, the same damp. Sometimes at night I hear it, plaster cracking, settling, as if it's trying to breathe." "Plaster," said Purbright gently, "is a material of patience, not animation. It only changes shape when someone persuades it to." But her composure had frayed. She stood, trembling slightly. "You'll see. The river will tell you where it's gone. Everything finds its level, Inspector. Even mistakes." They left her house in silence. Down by the bridge, mist was rising from the water in thin, restless veils. Something pale floated against the current, catching briefly in the reeds before turning over and vanishing beneath. Love crossed himself out of habit rather than belief. Purbright watched the darkening ripples and said, almost to himself, "Flaxborough does tidy up after its scandals, sometimes with a broom, sometimes with a current." They stood there a moment longer, the sound of the river gentle but insistent, like a secret being repeated until it lost all meaning. The morning mist had thinned to a pale veil by the time Inspector Purbright returned to Widow's Lane. He carried no warrant, only curiosity, the kind that, in his experience, solved more crimes than any enthusiasm for paperwork. The river below the lane ran brown and restless after the rain, its surface broken by twigs and the occasional bubble of something not quite innocent. He paused by Mrs. Vinicum's allotment. The marigolds, there, petals battered by weather and neglect, drooped over the soil that had lately held more than vegetables. The shed door was open again, not from carelessness this time, but intention. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wet plaster, earth and something sourly sweet, like damp flowers left too long in a vase. A single chair stood against the wall, and on it a towel folded with almost ceremonial neatness. Beneath the towel was a small wooden box. Purbright lifted the lid with the caution one reserves for anything in Flaxborough described as nothing to worry about. Inside lay a handful of photographs, black and white images of the flower show, of the old Catamole cottage, and of Dr. Mortlake, caught mid-lecture before a small audience of women at the town hall. The last photograph was more curious. A close shot of a clay mold half filled with wet plaster, the features indistinct but recognizable as Mortlake's. The picture had been taken recently, the edges still crisp. Purbright slipped the photographs back into the box and closed it. He had, he suspected, reached the point in the mystery where the dead stopped speaking, but the living continued to dig. Back at the station, Constable Love was cleaning his boots and looking faintly heroic about it. He straightened when Purbright entered. "Sir, there's talk going round. Fishermen downriver found something at the bend near Stannard's mill. Said it looked like a statue. Couldn't tell in the fog." Purbright gave a single nod. "We'd better investigate before they start charging admission." They found it half an hour later, snagged against the reeds and reeds themselves already gossiping about it in the current. It was the bust, the missing head, now grey with silt and softened by water. The features were still clear. Mortlake's expression, serene and absurdly dignified, gazed upward through the murky shallows. Purbright crouched beside it, his boots sinking into the mud. "Plaster," he said softly, "does not float for long. Someone meant this to be found." Love frowned. "Why, sir?" "Because in Flaxborough," Purbright replied, "people prefer their secrets explained to them before supper." They had it carried carefully back to the station where the damp began to release a faint odor of decay. Old water, old intentions. Purbright studied it under the harsh electric light, noting the way the neck had been crudely filled with something other than plaster. Cement, perhaps. He tapped it gently with a pencil. It gave a dull, solid note. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." Love, hovering nearby, peered at the waterlogged surface. "Could have been weighted, sir. That's why it sank." "Or why it was meant to sink," Purbright said. "Cement makes a fine ballast for things one wishes to bury permanently." He fetched a small knife from his drawer and began scraping gently at the neck seam. As the cement crumbled, away, a thin metallic glint appeared beneath. He worked patiently until he could pull free a small locket embedded inside the mixture. Its chain was twisted and rusted, but the oval casing opened easily enough under his thumbnail. Inside, beneath cracked glass, was a faded photograph of a young woman. The inscription on the back read, "To H.C. Forever, E.V." Love blinked. "That's the widow, sir. Edith Vinicombe, before she was Mrs. Vinicombe. And H.C. Harold Cattermole." Purbright sat back. "So, we've gone full circle, the widow's hand in her neighbour's head. Quite the reunion." He replaced the locket in the drawer and stood. "Love, fetch Mrs. Vinicombe. Politely, please. If she's in no state to walk, we'll provide a chair." When she arrived an hour later, escorted by Love and looking smaller than usual in her neat coat, Purbright offered her the chair opposite his desk. On it, under a cloth, rested the plaster bust, newly dried. "Mrs. Vinicombe," he began quietly, "I'm afraid your creation has been somewhat too revealing. The cement inside contained a locket belonging to the late Mrs. Cattermole. Do you recognize it?" Her eyes flicked to the cloth, then to him. "I thought it was gone," she said softly. "I buried it with the others. It must have worked its way back up." It hadn't. It was hidden, sealed into the plaster. That required some care. And motive. She drew a slow breath. It was hers, yes. Edith's. I found it after she died, in the flooded cellar. I meant to keep it safe, but somehow it became part of everything else. The molds, the memories, it all blurred together. Or perhaps, Purbright said gently, it was more deliberate than that. The initials inside, H.C., your husband's namesake. She made her art to keep hold of him, and you continued the practice to keep hold of her. You didn't mean harm, only remembrance. But memories have an awkward habit of surfacing, as you've seen. She looked at him with weary defiance. Then let them. I'm tired of hiding ghosts in garden sheds. You can take it all, Inspector. I've no more use for any of it. Purbright nodded. I rather think the town's had its fill of sculpture for one generation. But before we close the matter, one thing. Why model Mortlake at all? She gave a faint, almost wistful smile. Because he reminded me of Harold Cattermole. The same arrogance, the same way of believing he was preserving what he was only collecting. I thought if I made his likeness, I'd understand what she saw in men like that. But plaster tells you nothing. It keeps no warmth. Purbright studied her in silence. Outside, the clock on the town hall struck 5, each chime deliberate, unhurried, like punctuation in a confession. When she rose to leave, he didn't stop her. Good day, Mrs. Vinicombe. Do keep your marigolds. They seem harmless enough. After she'd gone, Love exhaled. You think that's the end of it, sir? End. Purbright looked out through the rain-streaked window. Nothing ever ends in Flaxborough, Love. It merely hardens. Inspector Purbright lingered in his office long after the lamps had been turned low, his pipe unlit and forgotten beside the cold teapot. The river had yielded its last secret, and Mrs. Vinicombe's confession, partial, weary, and oddly serene, had closed the official file. But something in its quiet symmetry bothered him. In Flaxborough, he reflected, nothing ever ended exactly where it began. The town preferred its endings to resemble continuations with the edges tidied up. He glanced again at the locket resting in its evidence envelope. The faint engraving, "To H.C. Forever, E.V., had grown no clearer with study, yet its implication had deepened. Mrs. Vinicombe's maiden initials were E.V. Yes, but so too were those of Edith Cattermole, the widow of Widow's Lane. The two women, separated by time, were connected by more than sentiment. Purbright wondered, not for the first time, whether E.V. had written to her own husband, or to someone else's. Love entered quietly, carrying a sheaf of reports and a sandwich wrapped in newspaper. No more from the museum, sir. They're saying the bust'll dry out and be kept in storage, seeing as it's, well, evidence of civic heritage. He hesitated. Mrs. Vinicombe's gone to stay with her niece in Cleethorpes. Took the afternoon train. Purbright nodded absently. Did she seem relieved? More like emptied, sir. Said she was leaving Flaxborough before the rain washed her back into it. Purbright smiled faintly at that. A poet's farewell, though poets, like plaster, tend to crack when removed from their setting. He rose, gathering his coat. Come along, love. Let's have a look at Widow's Lane once more. There's something about that soil that refuses to rest. Dusk had folded itself neatly over the town by the time they arrived. The allotments were silent except for the slow drip of water from eaves and leaves and the faint rattle of a gate in the wind. Purbright walked toward the shed, whose door now swung free on one hinge. The marigolds were almost gone, their stalks brittle and blackened. He crouched near the patch where the plaster fragments had first been unearthed and brushed the surface with his gloved hand. Notice anything odd, love? Only that we keep coming back here, sir, the constable replied, like bad gardeners. Purbright's fingers traced a small depression in the soil, circular and faintly metallic. He pressed lightly. Something moved beneath. A little digging produced a small brass tag, tarnished but legible. Property of Flaxborough Museum, 1939. He held it up in the fading light. Well, well, he murmured. It seems our missing pieces were never stolen at all. They merely returned to their owner. Love looked puzzled. You mean the casts belonged to the museum from the start? Precisely. Mrs. Vinicum wasn't preserving her neighbor's relics. She was retrieving her own. I believe she, or Edith Cattermole before her, donated them long ago, perhaps when the museum first opened. Then, when war and flood came, she took them back, privately. They were her way of remembering herself, not anyone else. So the locket was never a token of affection between two people, Purbright finished quietly. It was a claim of ownership, a mark on her creation, like a signature. Evie made them, and she ensured that no one forgot. He replaced the tag gently, covering it with soil. Flaxborough doesn't produce villains, love. Only citizens who've mistaken permanence for virtue. They all want to be remembered, even if only in plaster. Love considered this as they walked back toward the road. What'll happen to the head now, sir? Purbright smiled faintly. It will dry, crack, and eventually crumble. The museum will misplace its label, and someone, 50 years hence, will dig it up and invent a new story for it. That, love, is how history survives in this town, through repetition and polite error. At the bridge, the river murmured beneath them, patient and unjudging. A pale object turned slowly in the current, perhaps a petal, perhaps only foam. Purbright watched it drift away until it was lost among the reflections of the lamps. Well, he said at last, that's Widow's Lane set to rights, or at least as right as it ever wishes to be. Love nodded, stamping his boots against the cold. Strange business, sir, all that fuss for a handful of plaster. Purbright looked at him with quiet amusement. The smallest materials, love, are often those that outlast us. Cement, gossip, and memory. Each hardens quicker than truth. They walked on in companionable silence, their footsteps soft against the wet pavement. The town lay peaceful again, its scandals neatly boxed and stored like the museum's exhibits, waiting, patient as always, for the next curious hand to disturb the dust.